In the previous video, I gave a very high-level overview of the concepts of website optimization, including the concept of caching. When it comes to websites, there are, in fact, multiple levels of caching, all the way from caching the fully rendered HTML output of a page, to caching parts of that HTML, to caching the raw data that helps to make that page. In this video, I'll show you how to apply a concept called output caching that helps you tackle the first level of caching by enabling you to cache entire pages of your ASP.NET MVC website. Before we begin applying full page caching to every page in our site, let's stop to figure out which pages could benefit the most from it, or rather, which pages change so frequently that caching them for any significant length of time would end up showing stale data more often than not. When I consider the pages of our small demo site, 3 pages come to mind, and they are the auction list page, the auction details page, and the site's home page. The first page, the auctions list page, comes to mind because it is such a bad candidate for a full page output caching. In other words, assuming that we have any significant amount of traffic on our site, this page would be changing so frequently with newly added auctions that if we cache it for more than a few seconds, we run the risk of not seeing those new auctions as soon as they're posted. The second page, the auction details page, however, makes an excellent candidate for full page caching. That's because once the auction has been posted, none of this information ever changes. Well, none of this information except for the current price. It seems like it's almost a perfect candidate for full page caching if it weren't for that little bit of information. So let's put that page on hold for now. Maybe later we can figure out some other way to cache just the data that never changes. With the auction details page off the table, that means we are left with one page, the site's home page. The page that has never changed once since we created the site. It's the perfect candidate. Applying full page caching to a page on an ASP.NET MVC website happens at the controller action level. Here, we can apply the output cache attribute to the controller action that we decide to cache. To see the output cache attribute in action, open up the Home controller and find the index action that produces the home page. We will apply output caching to this action in just a moment, but first, in order to see the effect that output caching has, let's modify the action to include a timestamp of when it was rendered. You'll be able to tell that the output caching is working when this timestamp remains the same as you refresh the page. Without output caching in place, when we refresh the page, we can see that this time changes with every refresh. Now that we have our test in place, we can apply the output caching attribute to the action and set its duration property to the number of seconds that we wish to cache the page for. In this example, I'm going to set the duration to 3 seconds, just long enough to prove that caching is indeed working. With this in place, we can go ahead and run the site again. Notice the timestamp that is rendered when you first run the page. Then keep refreshing the page and notice that the timestamp only gets updated every 3 seconds or so. This means our cache is working. In addition to the duration property, the output cache attribute exposes several other properties that provide you with better control over things such as what is cached, how long it is cached for, and where it is cached. If you have ever used the output caching feature in an ASP.NET Web Forms site, these output caching options may seem familiar to you. That's because the output cache attribute is merely a thin wrapper on top of the output caching functionality that the core ASP.NET framework provides. Now that I've shown simple output caching in practice, let's revisit the other 2 pages that we said weren't very good for caching, the auction list page and the auction details page. I decided before not to try and cache the auction list page because I was worried that caching this page for even a few seconds might mean that users may get stale data. What then is the smallest caching duration that we might be able to get away with? 1 second? It sounds silly to cache something for a single second, huh? Well, that's not necessarily true. Caching for very small amounts of time, known as micro-caching, is an emerging trend that is beginning to show some promise. Consider why this might be true. In a majority of cases, the real bottleneck in website performance is database access. And when 1,000 requests come in for the same page, all within the same second, without any caching on that page, that means that the site must make 1,000 database queries, 1,000 of the same database query producing the same output. Thus, by caching that output for even 1 second, you can reduce those 1,000 queries to just 1. In the web world, a single second can be a long time. So let's go ahead and throw the output cache attribute on the index action of the auctions controller and set its duration to 1 second. With this in place, we can still take advantage of output caching without showing our users stale data. Now that a duration of 1 second isn't such a silly notion anymore, I think it's feasible to apply output caching to the auction details page too. While we may not be able to cache this page for a long time, we can cache it for at least a few seconds. So let's place the output cache attribute on the auction controller action too. When we're ready to go live with the site, we can be a bit more generous with this one's duration, say 3 seconds. But for our testing purposes right now, let's use something that we can actually see, such as 10 seconds. Now, go ahead and run the site and visit the details page for a few of the auctions. Notice how the output cache attribute caches each individual page by itself. That is, the auction with the ID 1 is cached separately from the auction with the ID number 2. We can even apply the timestamp trick like we did before to make sure that the caching is actually working. For example, if we visit the page for auction number 1, we can see the timestamp of 11:05:34 a.m. Now, if we switch to auction number 2, we can see a different timestamp. But if we go back to auction number 1 and refresh the page, we can still see 11:05:34 a.m., indicating that the two pages are being cached separately. In this video, I showed you how to apply ASP.NET MVC's output cache attribute to your controller actions to cache the full page output that they generate. In the next video, I'll show you how to provide more fine-grained control over your page by caching only certain parts of it.